Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of our Homeroom webinar series, A Growing Epidemic Addressing Violence in American Schools. My name is Erica Vaverka, and I'm Director of K-12 at the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute or joining our webinar series for the very first time, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and we serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education continuum through in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance, including this webinar series. Before getting the conversation started, I want to provide a brief logistical overview of what to expect with us today. We'll start our discussion with about a 30-minute moderated conversation with our great panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And then we'll pivot to a Q&A with our audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. We'll also record this conversation and in the next couple of days, post it to our YouTube channel so you can share with colleagues or others who are unable to join us this afternoon. We also encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. You should see that right there on our screen. And we also will be live tweeting from our Twitter account @HuntK12Ed, which you also can see in the top right corner of the screen on our PowerPoint slide. We have a great conversation ahead of us, so let's get started. Gun violence, of course, is a growing epidemic in American schools. In fact, more than 300,000 students have experienced gun violence in schools since the 1999 Columbine attack. From high-profile attacks in Uvalde, Parkland, and Sandy Hook within the last decade to less publicized and unreported daily incidents of gun violence, school-centered violence seems to have become a regular part of American life. We also know addressing school-based violence is top of mind for parents and voters on both sides of the aisle. The Hunt Institute's recently published 2022 Across the Aisle report, which we'll drop in the chat for you, we included a survey which found that concerns around school safety remain highly prevalent among parents and voters, with 3 in 4 voters believing guns and other physical violence in our schools are a problem, and a similar number also believing bullying and cyberbullying are a problem as well. More than half of voters also indicated that they would support public officials who acknowledge the need to address all forms of physical violence in schools. It's critical to bring together leaders, policymakers, educators, communities, families, students, and all other stakeholders to tackle these issues head-on. So today we'll hear from experts and leaders in the field who have dedicated themselves to improving school safety outcomes for every student. We'll be learning about how states are implementing and designing school safety protocols, hearing about challenges, best practices, and lessons learned from the field, and what role we all can play in keeping our students and schools safe. With us for this conversation, we have first, Dr. Eric Mackey, who has been State Superintendent of Education for Alabama since April 2018. Superintendent Mackey also served on Alabama's SAFE Council, which focused on securing school facilities, identifying potential threats, and providing interventions for students who are at risk of committing violence. Thank you so much for being here today, Superintendent Mackey. Next, we have Robert Runcie, who is the interim leader of Chiefs for Change. Robert also is the former superintendent of Broward County Public Schools, where he led the nation's 6th largest district with more than 260,000 students and 35,000 employees, including through the mass shooting event at Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018. Welcome, Robert. Thank you for being here today. And last but certainly not least, we have Karen Fairley, who serves as the executive director of the Center for Safer Schools, which serves to promote a safe learning environment for all North Carolina K-12 public and charter schools. Thank you to all our panelists. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and we'll jump right into the conversation and our first question. And again, for our audience, as we go through today's conversation, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. So our first question is for Superintendent Mackey. Superintendent, in 2018, you were appointed chair of the SAFE Council, which we talked about in your introduction, which stands for Securing Alabama's Facilities of Education, which was charged with developing recommendations to keep Alabama schools and students safe. Can you talk about some of the recommendations that came out of that work and the impact it has had in Alabama since?
Gladly, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this today. So when I came into this office after being a local superintendent and working in public schools for a number of years, it was just a couple of months, unfortunately, after the tragedy in Parkland, Florida, that Superintendent Runcie had to oversee and deal with on a daily basis. And being new in this job as the state chief, our governor put together this SAFE Council. She named me and the head of our state police force as co-chairs. And we came up with a list of recommendations around what safer school facilities should look like. And so some of those were simply building out better safety plans. We already required schools to have safety plans, but one of the things we launched then, we've been working on since, is making sure all those plans are digitized and that police have access to them, not publicly, but police access to them under a secure firewall. And then also trying to get better camera systems in our schools, better locking systems and those sort of things. And those camera systems, one of the things we want are for police to be able to pull up. I apologize, I'm fighting a little bit of some allergies, but we want police to be able to pull up into a school parking lot if there's an incident and be able to log into the school's camera. That's a lot easier said than done. What we found was that you have so many camera providers, so many different internet protocols out there. And so we're still working through that. But that was a part of the SAFE Council's report. So kind of securing and modernizing what our campuses look like. But another part of it dealt with the mental health piece. So we realized that not only did we have to use that term harden our schools, we also had to make sure that the students in our schools felt safer, and that if there was a threat, that students felt like they could come forward and tell us there was a threat, report the threat to adults in the school or to law enforcement or even their family members. That if family members and community members felt like there was a threat, that they felt like there was somebody they could report it to. And that if we could identify which students might be suffering mental health conditions, that we could get them treatment and help quickly. And I think that's been one of the most difficult things we've had to encounter is how do we identify those students? How do we identify who's a true threat to themselves or others? And get them into the proper sort of treatment immediately. So we also talked, the last piece about that is school resource officers. So we have about 400 school resource officers, about 1,600 campuses. Now we have more police. That's another interesting caveat, as many people know. To be a school resource officer means you have specialized training in dealing with youth and working in schools. And so even though we only have 400 school resource officers, we have several hundred more police officers who do come in and out of our schools. And one of our recommendations is to really improve the training and get more school resource officers in our schools.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Mackey, to share a little bit more about that council, as well as some of the topics that you're really focusing on. So that was great to hear. Robert, want to transition to you next. Certainly, as Superintendent Mackey also referenced, you have a personal connection to this topic, having served as superintendent during the Parkland tragedy. Today, as part of your role at Chiefs for Change, you are leading an initiative that brings together school safety cohorts to strengthen campus security policies and practices that improve accountability. Can you tell us more about this work and what makes the initiative effective? And I think we may have lost Robert for a moment. So Karen, we're going to move on to you, and hopefully we'll be able to get Robert back. This is the magic of a virtual webinar. We like to keep you on your toes. So we'll try to get Robert back on. And Karen, I'm going to jump to you. Karen, the North Carolina Center for Safer Schools provides a variety of services, including education, training, mental health services, emergency preparedness, and more for over 2,500 public schools across North Carolina. We know that the center recently awarded $74 million in school safety grants to the state's 200 school districts. How have schools been thinking about using this funding, and what promising practices have you seen as a result of this opportunity?
Okay, and so again, thank you for allowing me this opportunity. And just for clarity, North Carolina has 115 school districts and over 200 charter schools. So just so that somebody in North Carolina won't say, where did we acquire all of these additional school districts? But what we saw is we had 200 applications for these funding, and we provided SRO funding for SROs for schools who needed and wanted them, services for students in crisis. And so we saw a big ask as it relates to issues surrounding mental health and mental health support. We received applications for training to increase school safety, restorative practice training, just ensuring that the legislative trainings that are required were done with a great deal of integrity. So we saw a lot of that. And definitely we saw ask for school safety equipment. And so those equipments range from cameras to window tinting to digital support on access of control. And so we constantly want to ensure that our districts and our charter schools have what they need. And so because the districts are very autonomous, they make the decision on what is best for their area. And we at the center do the best that we can to comply. Our General Assembly was very generous in providing us those additional fundings in a short session because they understood the need and the seriousness of school safety. And so we are very happy to have been able to give out that type of money for districts. And so we're anticipating great midterm reports in the early spring on what was actually accomplished and whether or not goals and objectives were met at what level. We're sure they'll be met, but at what level? So we are excited about that.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing some of the work that you're doing. We appreciate it. We know that you are dealing with some things today as well. So thank you for joining us. And Robert, happy to turn it back to you. And it always seems like our computers are rebooting just when we need them the most. So certainly understand that. And our question for you was that we know that you have a personal connection to this topic with Superintendent Mackey, also referred to being that you were superintendent of Broward County Schools during the Parkland tragedy. Today, as your role as interim leader of Chiefs for Change, you're leading an initiative that brings together school safety cohorts to strengthen campus security policies and practices and improve accountability. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work and what makes the initiative effective? Oh no, I think we lost Robert again. Okay. Surely third time will be the charm. But until then, I do have a follow-up question for both you and Superintendent Mackey, and hopefully we'll be able to get Robert back on for our question for him. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to the Q&A. So if you haven't already, and if you have questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A. My question, the follow-up question that I wanted to ask all of you is, in your roles as education leaders, policy practitioners, what challenges have you faced in bringing people together to have these conversations about school violence? And what practices have been effective in making meaningful steps toward ensuring our schools are safe? And Superintendent Mackey, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. You know, as was just mentioned by my colleague, one of the difficult things that we work with on a state level is, of course, all of our schools are locally run. And each school has its own, they have kind of community needs. They have community standards. They're working with local sheriffs and police departments. But more importantly, they have really very different campuses. So we have some campuses that are, some buildings that are 100 years old. We have some that are very new and have all the modern technology built in. One of the things we've found, requests for funding, and yet one of the most difficult challenges is to take these buildings that are 30, 40, 50 years old and really secure, or again, I'll use that word, harden those campuses. So we talk about, one entrance point, a secure entrance point. On a new building, we have lots of secure entrance points. We have ways to make sure that parents or visitors have to be funneled through certain openings in the building or in the envelope of the building. But in these old buildings, we have doors everywhere, and they're just much more difficult to secure. So one of the things we've found is you go into the front door, we've built airlock systems that are very secure. But again, there may be other entrances around the facility that are much harder to get to. So that's been one of the challenges is everybody would like to have a new, very safe facility, but we're dealing with older facilities that we have to bring up to par. Another challenge has been cultural. So certainly in many neighborhoods, whether you're in a small town or a large city or in a rural community, there are a lot of schools that we want schools to be open and we want parents to feel welcome. But in many of these communities, parents have been able to just kind of walk onto the school or come visit the playground for years. And we can't allow that anymore. So we're having to change the culture so people know we have to know who's on campus. We have to have a secure way for them to get on campus. And that sometimes offends people because they're like, I'm a grandmother. I've been coming to this campus for years. That I'm not a safety threat. But of course, we have to treat everyone in the same way. So I think both the cultural piece and the facility piece have been tough as far as challenges we've had to overcome.
Thank you so much. And before we jump to Karen, I'm actually going to turn it over to Robert. Robert, so sorry for your technical difficulties. The question we're asking was around the school safety cohorts initiative that you're leading as interim leader at Chiefs for Change on strengthening campus security policies and practices, as well as improving accountability. We'd love to hear more about this work and what makes it effective.
Sure, and I would just want to start by saying thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting this very important and timely conversation today. We're going to maybe switch to another screen here. Districts spend a lot of money on things that you can plug in and install to help improve school safety and security. State governments, federal government provide funds toward these initiatives and priorities. These are things like cameras, metal detectors, door locks, fences, visitor management systems, intercoms, emergency radios, the list goes on. This funding also goes to school resource officers, law enforcement, communications, armed security staff, to deal with an imminent threat to schools. And these are items we would traditionally consider and call them hardening efforts, which help harden the layers of security used to keep kids and teachers and adults safe in our schools. There are also mental health initiatives, behavioral threat assessment initiatives, see something, say something, reporting initiatives as well to help identify and provide services to those who need them the most, as well as to improve the intelligence that school districts use to help keep our students safe. So what we found though, and most important, these things have two elements in common. First, they have a human factor to their usage, right? So there's a human element to it. So for example, if you've got cameras, they need to be working, but somebody needs to be trained to watch them and utilize them and manage those. And the second thing is the time that is spent on a lot of these elements can actually take away from the core mission of schools, and that's educational achievement and attainment of kids. And currently, most districts don't have a mechanism to, one, gather data to validate that the money and investments that they're actually making, which is millions and millions of dollars, is going to initiatives that are being implemented and utilized properly. So our work at Chiefs for Change has been to create a cohort that's focused on two things. First, helping districts approach these safety and security policies and practices and investments in a more organized and effective manner so that they can spend less time on them and more time on the primary mission of education. Secondly, gathering data to help the districts determine the efficacy of their safety and security programs and investments and policies to make sure that they are being resourced appropriately and that they're being implemented properly. If you've got policies that you put in place, but you have no overarching mechanism where you can look on a daily basis and tell for every school, every classroom, every day that the policies are being implemented, then that's a huge challenge. So we're putting in systems and structures in schools as part of this cohort to essentially create a cultural shift for most districts, but also make sure that we're focused on an all hazards approach to safety, right? And security, which is not always going to be responding to what the latest tragedies are that are getting the most attention.
Thank you so much for that response, and we're glad to hear a little bit more about this initiative. And while I have you, I'm going to ask you the follow-up and then go to Karen to close us out before we do the Q&A. Our follow-up question for everyone is, as we've seen and as we think many in this space are grappling with, discussions around school violence are not always easy to have and can often be a political lightning rod. But as we noted earlier, school safety certainly is top of mind for parents and voters. What challenges have you faced in bringing people together to have these conversations about school violence? And what practices have been effective in making meaningful steps toward ensuring our schools are safe? And Robert would love to turn.
Okay, so that's, yeah, all right.
That's great,
So,
thank you.
yeah, I would say that, a couple of things. I think the focus in a lot of this work has, diverted away from, what's in the best interest of kids. And it's really focused a lot, unfortunately, into adult problems, what adults are feeling oftentimes, uninformed opinions on complex issues. So the challenge is bringing the discussion back to where it should be. The guidance I always gave staff is to do the work, make sure things are being done and implemented with fidelity. School safety initiatives, whether anti-bullying campaigns, improved active assailant training, policy revisions, these things all take time, but the public wants quick solutions now. And school districts struggle through long-term initiatives that work because the public perception or the political climate, when it shifts, the work gets derailed and something else gets started, even if what was being implemented was actually reasonable, effective, and evidence-based. So even with the high percentage of individuals, as you stated, that state that these issues are a priority from the survey, they also have vastly different thoughts on how we should go about solving them. There isn't sufficient budget or staffing to do everything. So districts must make the best decisions they can with the data they have on hand at the time and try to tune out a lot of the noise.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate those reflections. And Karen would love to ask you the same question before we turn it over to Q&A.
Right. And so here in North Carolina, I have been fortunate that that school safety has been a nonpartisan issue. Every child deserved a safe school, and our General Assembly, our legislators have been very gracious into hearing all aspects and allowing me as the school safety executive director to propose to them the needs. And then they have also been consistent in being generous in providing what I said I needed at that particular time. The North Carolina received from the General Assembly monies for a training center that is attached to the Center for Safer Schools that will focus only on school safety. That is what I asked for. That is what the General Assembly provided for us. So our leadership in the Department of Public Instruction and our legislators are wanting to move away from it being politicized to concern about the children. And so I have reached across many aisles to bring a multidisciplinary team together that works on focusing about school safety. The only challenge that we may have is North Carolina states is from the mountain to the coast. And so people in the mountains have other issues or needs, and people on the coast have something different needs. And an example, on the coast, we have one of our districts that has a ferry that connects to the mainland. And so that's an issue that the rest of the state wouldn't have. So our challenges is just really focusing on the individual districts, but we have not had challenges as it relates to that, while I've been here. We also are spending quite a bit of time identifying people who need to be at the table, parents. So the Center for Safer Schools has connected with our North Carolina PTA Association. And people say, well, all parents are not in the PTA. That may be true, but the PTA can touch all parents. We have started 3 student engagement initiatives so that we can get our children to come to us and to let us know who better than them on what's going on in their campus. So we are focusing on that. So our approach is, listen, we want to hear from the stakeholders who have a vested interest. And it goes without saying that our administrators and our teachers are part of this multidisciplinary team that we've created. And so we listen to what they have. I'm going to be addressing the superintendent's quarterly meeting on this Friday, because we're all in this to ensure that everyone goes home at the end of the day. And so I don't know about other states because I'm in North Carolina, but they have given me the latitude to run the center as I see fit and to make it as nonpartisan as possible. And that's what we're attempting to do. We are definitely wanting to ensure that the schools get whatever resources that we can give them. And like Mr. Runcie said, I mean, there's really not enough manpower and dollars to cover it all, but we do want to do what we can. And we want our districts to know that we support their efforts.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just one thing about just something about the school resource officers. I know that's been debated, and there are some school districts in this country who have moved away from that and significantly limited the number of school resource officers or eliminated them altogether. I don't agree with that position. I think the role of the SROs continues to evolve. And instead of thinking of law enforcement as a separate entity or resource independent of the larger safety and security plan, if we have, SROs or law enforcement in schools, then we need to make sure that they're properly trained and they're not just there to respond to a violent incident, but they're also there for dealing with students with special needs, developing a positive relationship with historically marginalized youth and students of color. And I believe it is an opportunity for communities to enhance the relationship that they have with law enforcement. And that can actually start at the local school level. The goal for everything related to safety and security must be a partnership, and it's not an us versus them, or having an SRO or not having one. It's really about a partnership and how we can all work together better. I think there are a lot of creative approaches out there that have been employed in what I call the post George Floyd moment, but we need to make sure that we don't remove school safety related resources without adding resources to mitigate the risk that they were originally there to address.
Thank you so much. And that dovetails really nicely into our first question. So you're welcome to add more to that, and also want to make sure that Superintendent Mackey and Karen also have the opportunity to respond. But a commonly cited solution to school safety concerns, as you mentioned, is to provide additional resources for school resource officers or other officials on school grounds. While some districts cite SROs as a great benefit to their school safety ecosystem, other districts highlight research showing racial equity concerns with bringing armed officers into school buildings as a potential concern. As policymakers, how can schools go about implementing policies that keep students safe, and in particular, continue to supporting historically underserved students?
Now, I'd like to jump in on top of that, really building on what Superintendent Runcie just said. So it's a really good question, but you can address that. So first of all, school resource officers, true school resource officers, school resource officers or SROs are trained in working with students, not just in, just a typical police response to a situation. So one of the things that NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers, we have a really good relationship with them. We're fortunate because their national headquarters is actually in Hoover, Alabama. And we have a strong state association of school resource officers. And so the training they do actually is about noticing which students really need someone to reach out to them. They almost become counselors. And so we find that we don't have any issues or no issues reported to us, at least, with SROs. Now, occasionally, and again, I want to be cautious saying this because we appreciate all of our police officers and sheriff's deputies that work in schools, but we do have some situations where, say, a large force, they just have to they send someone to the school, but it may be a different person every day. So they may have somebody who walks into the school as security person. They're not truly a trained SRO, and they've never really been around teenagers. And that's when sometimes we do have issues. So we need to make sure that training takes place as much as it possibly can be done ahead of time. And then I just want to challenge one other thing. We have a lot of security personnel in our schools that are not, who are not armed. So just because this person wears a uniform and they're doing security does not necessarily mean they have to be armed. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. And again, we think that there's a place for both armed officers, but also unarmed officers, people who wear full police uniform with vest and everything. And then we have some SROs and security folks who come to school and they have they're wearing a golf shirt and khakis. And so that's another way to make sure that students feel more comfortable around officers. The last thing I want to say is that we can take that as a real opportunity. So most young people, whether they're in underserved communities or not, most people have not had an interaction with a law enforcement person unless they've gotten a traffic ticket or something. And so bringing SROs into school, it can be a real benefit because it can show people that as an officer of the law, I'm here to help, not here to look for things that are going wrong, or I'm not out to get you. And so I think we can flip that and make it a very important lesson, but we have to consciously do that. The questioner's right. There can be a lot of problems if you don't consciously make sure that training and that focus is in place.
And so what I want to say is that the Center for Safer Schools gave out over $33 million this year to support SROs. So we definitely understand the need for them. We are working with our Justice Academy, who provides our basic law enforcement training services, to develop curriculum or to enhance curriculum. They already have curriculum to address some of the racial disparities that have been brought up. And so we're feeling really confident that with having us work in tandem, that we're going to do what is necessary to make our children feel as comfortable as they can. We definitely know that in doing it with the Justice Academy and providing that training, we're on the new training facility that we're having, we're going to add a component and train or provide training to our school administrators on how best to utilize their SRO. One of the things that I think happens a lot of times is that the only two people who really know everything in the MOU may be the lawyers who drafted the MOUs. And so we definitely want our administrators to, as they move around and as new ones come in, to take an opportunity at the beginning of the year and see what that MOU says. What are the responsibilities for those SROs, and want to use them in a capacity, I think Dr. Mackey alluded to, as more of a mentor, and more of a support there. They are not there to be punitive. They are there to support. They are there to ensure that there's order, but they are definitely not there for disciplinary reasons. They are there to support the school all the way around, the administrators and the students and the parents in their absence. So we are definitely grateful for the opportunity to provide that amount of funding to our districts who wanted to keep SROs in the schools.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses and sharing your expertise on that topic of SROs. I'd like to move to the next question. We have a lot of great questions coming in, and as a reminder to the audience, we'll get to as many as we can. But our next question focuses on student mental health. Certainly, student mental health services are a critical intervention strategy to help students at risk of resorting to violence. These support systems are also important for students dealing with trauma. What can states, organizations, and policymakers be thinking about? Or what policies have you seen to be effective to ensure that students have access to necessary mental health services?
I'm not sure if we're supposed to start with order.
Well, you know, I would say this is probably an area where you can never have too many resources. And I think you talk to experts who've been involved in safety, they say this is the area where you really should be making the greatest investments. But there's a big challenge in this space, right? And that's finding, hiring, and retaining talent in these areas. I mean, districts are struggling to, staff teachers and all types of positions. This is one of those areas they struggle. So I think the strategy has to be a community-focused one. School systems can't do it all. The community needs to be involved in this, and not just in a response to a tragedy, but every day as part of the district's overall strategy to provide supports and services to students and families. We've seen that when the resources flow immediately after a tragedy, it's even difficult to vet them and coordinate them to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Organizing yourselves, the school system, community support agencies, mental health agencies working together on a daily basis to meet the mental health needs of the community, and in particular our students, really will go a long way, can stem some of the most serious mental health issues with our kids, particularly the ones leading to suicide. We also can't forget how traumatic the pandemic has been for our kids, with the lack of social supports and human contact over an extended period of time has done. So we've got to make sure that we're providing resources that are easy to access and don't carry a stigma with them.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Now, I want to mention a couple of things we've done as a state policy-wise. So we were able to work with our legislature a few years ago and pass what started as a pilot program, now has been extended statewide, and that's to put a mental health services coordinator in every school district. And that coordinator, I will tell you, in most cases, they're social workers. Some of them are mental health therapists, but they're people who are experts at getting resources to children. Now, cautiously, they're not therapists. Some of them may be licensed therapists, but we don't want them doing therapy because what we want them to do is to be coordinating services to make sure that children have services. And so that's what our mental health services coordinators do. It is a program, as I said, we have one in every district. And everybody here knows if you're in a district with 50,000 students, that's very different than being in a district with 1,000 students. So we're now trying to build that out and get extra capacity in our large districts. The second piece we have is a partnership, as many states do, with our Department of Mental Health to do in-school therapy. So we do want to offer therapy to students. And so we actually bring therapists into the schools. Obviously, parents have to give permission for the therapy to start. But instead of a parent having to pick a child up, check them out of school, take them to a mental health center for therapy, which has logistical problems, has more lost classroom time, and there's a stigma attached to that. What we can do, we bring the therapist into the schools and try to make it very low key, so the student is going to the office. They're going, obviously they're leaving class for a reason, but they're having that therapy on site. And so we think that's been very successful. The biggest problem, just to repeat what just been said, is our Department of Mental Health cannot find enough therapists. There are not enough therapists out there to fill all the roles where we need more.
And just one last thing I would add on that is that, there are a number of districts around the country who are getting innovative and solving this resource problem by engaging in telehealth, telemedicine, providing that remotely as a complement to what they have. So they're able to extend the capacity that they have in their systems.
And what I was going to say is that at this point, I concur with both gentlemen that is just not having enough health care providers, mental health care providers. Our General Assembly, I think year before last, gave quite a bit of money to the districts to hire them. But if there's no one to hire, then there's no one to hire. And so we are trying to work as best we can with the resources that we have. Definitely engaging a licensed clinical therapist at least to have some type of mental health personnel available. Definitely with our anonymous reporting system, they have a crisis center that is just more than just a call center. It is actually where they triage calls, and they have a PhD on staff. And so those are the kind of things that we are trying to do in North Carolina. And we did have a meeting, as what Superintendent Runcie said, as it relates to the telehealth. If that's the route that we have to go. And we saw during the pandemic how people were even utilizing it for medical. So definitely we feel that that's going to be one of the ways that we'll have to address it as it relates to school safety in North Carolina. But our Department of Public Instruction is definitely partnering with our Department of Health and Human Services, and greater minds than mine are coming up with other solutions as it relates to that.
Thank you, Karen. And I'd like to start with you for the next question that we have, which is, we're also having a national conversation around teacher shortages. And so we'd like to talk a little bit about how school violence is impacting the educator workforce and what can we do to support educators, and how have the supports that your organization have been advocating for and implementing also support educators?
Right. So the reality to school safety is that, it's a group effort. It is not just us on this panel or the legislator. It starts at home. And so definitely there has to be support from parents and guardians as we address this issue to support the teachers in and of themselves. My husband and I have 8 girls. So we understand the need to be supportive to the teachers. And I think that a lot of times what we're finding out is that people are working in silos. We need to bring the parents in as much as we can, but we also need to be sensitive to what's going on with them. How are we holding our meetings? How are our administrators engaging with our parents? How are our parents engaging with our administrators? And what do our children see in that engagement process? So I think that our teachers, I can't say enough about educators, because they have our children the bulk of most days. And it is necessary for us to support them. But it's also necessary for us to support the parents and giving them information and letting them know what's going on in the school and how their role is vitally important in creating a safer school, supporting the educators. So our superintendent has started a parent advisory group, and she got parents from all across different demographics and brought them together, because we want to hear from them. And we understand that in order to support educators, we have to start at home and get those parents to talk the same thing that we're talking at the state level, at the legislator, and even in the schools. And if everybody's talking the same thing and the children are hearing the same types of conversation, then that will help. And also, giving parents the opportunity to recognize when there is an issue. We're all very busy, and social media has gotten to a place where it's hard as a parent to keep up. And so if we help the parents to be able to identify when there are issues and have them have that open communication with educators, I think that is the beginning of addressing school safety and supporting the educators.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of things said. So one is, I absolutely believe that you have to provide access to mental health resources and supports for the adults in the system as well. I mean, that's got to be part of the overall strategy. I think there's funding to do that at this moment, as districts have infusion of significant amount of federal pandemic relief dollars. So even if you can't do it for the long term, do it for the short term when the impact is the greatest. The second thing I would say, need to continue to seek and staff, to the extent that they can, more counselors, social workers, mental health professionals in the schools to relieve some of the burden on the teachers for having to handle and deal with those issues, with their students. And then finally, I would say one of the challenges at the moment, and we talk about it quite a bit, is, how can we use this moment coming out of the pandemic to have a really critical look at public education? We have structures in place that's been there for more than 100 years. It's a factory size model, one size fits all. How do we just redesign public education at the same time, do it in a way that improves working conditions for teachers, makes it more attractive, and most importantly, improves the educational experience for kids, that they have a very different experience that's engaging, that leads to better outcomes.
Thank you. And I'd love to jump to the next question, and Superintendent Mackey, want to lead with you on this one. And we talked a little bit about social media and it being difficult for educators and for parents to keep up with what's happening online. So Superintendent Mackey, would love to ask you, how are districts keeping a pulse on student social media exposure, including alarming social media posts by students, other chatter, cyberbullying? What is the role of schools and educators to address misinformation, hate, etc. in the cyberspace?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, but it is a tough subject, and maybe one of the toughest subjects today that we'll address. So I think there are a couple of things. First, when you talk about true social media, so TikTok, TikTok mostly, but Snapchat, Twitter, and other things that students might be on. We can monitor some of that. We actually, in Alabama, our state police, and I'm sure other states do this too, we have what's called the Fusion Center, where they actually monitor social media accounts for special phrases. And we've been able to stop some problems because they find somebody says they're going to make, so threatening, if they mention a threatening post in a school, then they have a way to filter that out. Now, so folks know they're not going into anybody's house and violating privacy. Once you post something on a public social media, I mean, it's public. And so the police are able to monitor and do some things to help us with that. It's really hard for schools to do that. I mean, principals can't be monitoring all of students' social media pages. There are some things, obviously, free speech that are protected, but threats are not protected. I would say there are two issues that parents really have to help us with. So one is parents have got to see what their own children are posting. What are they on? What are they posting? What are they looking at? And then when they see problems, they've got to notify the school or notify law enforcement, whichever is the most appropriate at the time. The bigger problem we see, and it's not exactly to the question, or the bigger problem we're dealing with is not so much social media posts, but it's direct messaging. So it's bullying, cyberbullying, but it's going from student to student, or maybe it's in a group. So there might be 9 students in a Snapchat group, and they're all seeing it. It's not posted on the general web. If it's just posted and anybody in the world can see it, then many times we are capturing those, or a mother or a grandmother or another student sees it and they call it in and let us know something's going on. But where we see the bigger problem is actually these group text or again, TikTok, Snapchat, and it's cyberbullying, and it's a real problem. The schools have a role to play in it, but we can't do anything unless somebody reports it. And I think the last thing I want to say is we are learning more and more. We're doing a few things. We're not doing anything systemically statewide yet, but we're trying to figure out what are some social media ethics that we can teach young people, because some of them just don't, they don't understand. It's not, and what they need to ethically report if they see something else out there. I think that's a place we're still learning. And unfortunately, because the social media websites keep changing. Notice I did not say, when I was a young superintendent many years ago, the first threat I had to deal with was on MySpace. Most of the people watching this webinar today say, what the heck is MySpace? I've never heard of that. But it was out there, and then there was Facebook, and of course now Snapchat's where we see some of our biggest problems. So the platforms keep changing, and that's part of the problem we have, just chasing the platforms.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned MySpace. It brings back memories of when my kids were in middle school. One of them were actually, spent a lot of time on MySpace and started getting into, these conflicts, as you can imagine, that happens over these social mediums. And so my wife and I spent a lot of time with her, recognizing we couldn't just go cut it off. We had to convince her to disengage from this because it was bad for your mental health. It took like a few weeks, and then she ultimately did do so. So yeah, parents play a big role in this, as you said, Dr. Mackey, in terms of monitoring what's going on, and having conversations with their kids, and not just, hey, get off social media. You have to spend time and explain why and what the ramifications are, and even show them examples. The other thing I think the school system can do is having digital literacy classes and instruction at an early age for students, so that they understand, as you mentioned, etiquette. They understand how to manage themselves, what's proper and improper, and also identify risks. There are lots of risks for kids getting on social media, and where they can certainly be taken advantage of. Finally, from a security standpoint, I think one of the most effective things systems can do is have some kind of centralized monitoring that's staffed with technology and people who are constantly monitoring social media that's related to their district. I've seen that put in place and work fairly effectively, but it really is a challenge. It's a challenge not just for school systems, it's a challenge for this nation. And we got to remember that our schools don't exist in a vacuum. They are a reflection of what's going on in our broader society. And so there's a significant societal change that needs to take place relative to the toxicity of social media, which tends to have lots of misinformation, disinformation, just not good for our youth. And we got to figure out some way to manage that medium so it has less of an adverse impact on our kids in society.
And I just wanted to say that, definitely having, personally having the 8 daughters, and now we have 12 grandchildren. The social media has changed tremendously from when my oldest daughter, who's, I won't tell, but she's 40 plus, she don't want me to tell. But it's changed tremendously to where our grandchildren are now. And it's going to keep changing. And we as adults will not keep up. But we ask our parents to have those conversations, but also we started something, and we haven't, we're just piloting it, and it's called the Teen, I want to get it right, Teen Tech Talk Tuesday. And what we do is we share on social media with the young people challenges with social media, and how what you say on social media is there forever, and the impact that it has on you as a person, on your mental health, on your future, at how it's relevant to how people see you. And so we are hoping that helps the young people, but we also have conversations with our parents, asking them. Today, I mentioned earlier, we're having a challenge in North Carolina with swatting, and we asked the parents to not just share on social media, because when they do it, then the children see it, and then they do mimic it as well. But it's a problem that will not be resolved in my lifetime for sure. But we can just get the education out there, get the awareness out there to the parents and the students, and show them what happens when we are negligent and how we handle social media.
Thank you so much. And I think we will leave it there. I want to give a big thank you to Karen, Robert, Superintendent Mackey for taking time out of a really busy week with us. I'd also like to thank our attendees for engaging in such an important conversation. I hope you will join us for our next one, which is Thursday, January 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be joined by Dr. Marguerite Rosa of the Epidemic Lab at Georgetown University, North Carolina State Superintendent Catherine Truitt, and other leaders for a forward-looking discussion on synthesizing recent election results and what that means for education policy in 2023 and beyond. It'll be a great start to the year, so please register for that event if you're interested, and hope you can join us. We also encourage you to join us for our other upcoming K-12 webinars listed on the screen. You can register for these discussions by going to our website, which we will post in the chat. Thank you, it's already there. And with that, thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you all again soon.